how to show movement in our artwork. In a landscape, we have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Objects that are closest to you appear to be very large, and as they move into the background, get smaller and smaller. Notice how this path in the forest is fairly wide in the front, and as it winds into the background, it gets smaller and smaller. This is what we call perspective. For our drawing, we'll need a white piece of paper, a pencil and eraser, and a Sharpie for later. We're going to create a drawing that will direct our eye from the front of the paper all the way through to the background. I'll start with two vertical lines that are not perfectly straight because remember, this is going to be a tree. This tree is so close to you that you can't even see the bottom or the top of it. The things that are closest to you in a landscape are usually drawn closer to the bottom, and as they move into the middle ground, a little higher, and then even higher as they move into the background. As I draw more trees, I want to make sure and leave enough space somewhere in the middle for my path to wind through. As I draw more trees, I'll start a little higher on the paper each time and also get a little smaller. Using this technique illustrates space and depth in a work of art. Don't be afraid to make adjustments if you need to. That's why I like to start with pencil. Take your time as you draw and make adjustments where needed. There's no rush. Craftsmanship is important. I want this tree to start just a little lower to make more room for the tree behind it. As I start the windy path, I'm going to begin way down in the corner. And just imagine that line going behind the trees and wrapping back around into the horizon. I'm going to start the other side of the path as wide as I can, even if it has to go behind the front tree a little. I want to make sure it begins to get really narrow right about here, and then disappear into the background. Next, I'll need a horizon line. I probably should have done this before drawing the windy path, so you might want to do this part first as well. Remember, your drawing doesn't have to look exactly like mine. The path can wind in a different direction and the trees can be in different places, as long as you make room for everything to fit. Trees in the background will just be a series of vertical lines very close together. They're so far away that you won't see much detail. Go ahead and add some texture to your trees as well, just using some wiggly lines and some spirals. The next step will be to trace everything with a Sharpie and erase any pencil marks that are still showing through. This will have your picture ready for adding color in part 2. Let's start by coloring the trees. With a brown crayon or colored pencil, begin to color up and down just one side of each tree, pressing firmly to get a nice dark color. As you fill in the tree, get a little lighter and a little lighter as you move across to the other side. The idea is to allow the color to go from dark to light gradually, just like we did with our shaded vases. What we're doing here is creating a light side of the tree where the sun might be shining into the forest, and also a dark side where the shadow is. Continue coloring all the trees in the foreground and middle ground that way. You can even add a little black to the trees to make the shadow more dramatic. And if you have different shades of brown, go ahead and add a little texture. Remember, if you look closely at the bark of a tree, it's not all just one color. I'll be using watercolors to paint my winding path. I like to have more than one size brush on hand. I use the bigger brush to fill in large areas, and then the smaller brushes to get into smaller spaces. To help to show depth, I start really dark in the back and just kind of pull the color towards the front, getting lighter and lighter as I go. I can add a little more water as I go as well. Once you use most of the paint on the brush, you can go back and pick up some of the paint from the back and add to the front. To make it get lighter and lighter and blend it in nice and smoothly, I'm adding a little bit of water. Can you see how that change from light to dark takes your eye deep into the forest? I'm going to go ahead and color those thin trees in the background. I forgot to do that in the beginning. The crayon will create that wax resist that will make painting the sky much easier in the end. I want to let the path dry a little before I start to work on the grassy area, so I'm going to go ahead and work on the background. I'm going to start with blue, but you can use whatever color you want. I'm just going to paint right over those trees in the background. Remember how we talked about the wax resist? Also notice I'm not painting on top of the trees in the middle ground or the foreground because they're in front of where the sky is. Now let's move on back to the grassy area. I'm going to use green and I'm going to really load my brush with paint. I want it to look a little darker in the background, just like we did for the path, and just simply pull that color to the front and let it get lighter and lighter as we go. Now I'll mix a little blue with my green and just add it in some areas throughout the ground. If you've ever taken a walk in the forest, you might have seen the way the sun shines through the trees, casting shadows in some areas and adding light in others. Now I want to add some color to my painting, so I want to make it be a fall scene. I'll use some yellow and some red and maybe some orange. Of course, if you mix red and yellow together, it will create the orange on its own. Painting on the dry area of the paper will make the colors brighter and allow them to stay in one space. If you paint over the blue where it's wet, the colors will blend, and that's a nice effect as well. I'm going to go ahead and do a little of both. Now that this painting has dried a little, we'll add some texture and some details and some cast shadows. I've already added a little salt in some of the wet areas for texture. I'm using a crayon here to add a little texture to the ground area. You can do as much or as little as you like. And remember, if you don't have watercolors, you can color the whole background with a crayon or a colored pencil. Just try and follow the same steps for adding texture and shadows and details. For my cast shadows, I'm going to add a little black to that green that was already on my palette. I don't want this to be too thick. The shadow should be transparent. Remembering where my light is shining, I'm going to create my cast shadows on the other side in the opposite direction. When adding a shadow for a tree that's behind another one, you stop at the tree in front and continue just a little bit on the other side. You don't want to go over a tree that's in front of another. Remember, these shadows should be transparent, which means you can see through them a little. I'm also going to make a shadow down here in the foreground. This will make it look like it's coming from a tree that's not even in the picture. It will also help to create balance by adding something to that big space in the foreground that didn't have much detail. Next, I'll add some leaves to the ground area that have fallen from the trees. Don't overdo this part, just a little. This is another way of creating balance by taking some of the colors from the top and adding them to the middle. I'll even add some tempera paint in the end because it's a little more opaque and will show up a little more brightly. I know we didn't have tempera paint in our supply kits, so this part's optional. I'll even add a few white highlights and blend in a little purple for shadows.